So this and the next lecture, we are going to talk about global supply chain redesign. I think, we are talking of not global supply chain design, but redesign. This is because for a number of reasons that we have been dealing with in these lectures, the designs of today, the way you design the supply chains, they are not up to the mark. They are subject to all kinds of pressures, all kinds of disruptions and so on. So there is a need to think about how to redesign the supply chains. So that's what the topic for this lecture and the next one. So we are going to use, as before, the ecosystem framework to redesign the supply chains. So what people design supply chains as simple linear processes of goods and information swiftly passing through an efficient logistics and IT pipeline, and concentrate only on that part of the pipe directly controlled by them, or at best that of their customers and suppliers. In other words, they are looking at their part. If you are a manufacturer, you look at the manufacturing. If you are a supplier, you look at the supplier. If at the best, some of them, if you are a manufacturer, you look at the supplier and you look at the logistics players, but you don't look at the suppliers. Or if you are a manufacturer, you look at the distributors, but you don't look at the retailers. So if you are a distributor, you look at the manufacturers and retailers, or mostly retailers, and don't look at the manufacturing effects. So that is the current state of affairs. And also, as we said several times before, it is something like supply chain design, supply chain demand supply matching. So that is the kind of thing that we have, and this is a myopic view. This has to change, and people have to have an idea of the entire supply chain from end to end, from materials inputs to the end, the customer, to the consumer, and also look at all the things that are happening, the ecosystems, the governments in which your suppliers are subjected to, and so on. So basically, you have to take an ecosystem view of this. So what is supply chain redesign? The current supply chain networks, as they are designed today, and using all kinds of packages like ERP and others, are subject to disruptions and innovations in the ecosystem elements, resources crunch, and several other factors. In other words, there are disruptions due to earthquakes and so on. There are disruptions due to financial crisis. There are disruptions due to wars, and there are disruptions to oil price increases and so on. So, but ultimately, they will affect the supply chain performance and also the cost savings. So disruptions can originate from banks, from governments, bankruptcy of suppliers, natural disasters, piracy, cyber attacks, port strikes, and several other unknown factors. So one can say, look, we don't know where the disruptions are going to come. How can you mitigate them? Well, the issue, it is fine, but one cannot anticipate all risks, but they cannot be ignored either. You cannot say, I don't know the risk. These are known unknowns or unknown unknowns and so on. You can say all kinds of things. It's a perfect storm. It is something. It is like a black swan, and you can give any number of metaphors and try to escape from that. But at the end of the day, you cannot ignore them. You have to do something to mitigate them. So, not only disruptions, innovations in products, manufacturing and delivery processes, business models, government-government relations such as FTAs, regulations and deregulations, and many more affect the supply chain. So, there are technological disruptions which are happening like the cloud, big data, you name it, and wireless, cell phones. There are several things which are happening which will disrupt your supply chain. And fluctuations in resource costs, wages, oil prices, foreign exchange are important for the bottom line. For example, the prime thing why outsourcing to low-cost countries has been adopted and it was favored by the developing countries and the multinationals is because of the low cost sourcing. But that low cost is disappearing because of the wage increases. Oil price increases which will affect the transportation. There is a lot of foreign exchange fluctuations where the emerging market currencies are appreciating. So these will actually are important to the bottom line. So supply chain designed to take all these factors into account rather than resorting to expediting cost saving measures when unknown strikes. So what you usually do is, you basically remove your HR, try to save the costs in several ways. You resort to expediting when your logistics doesn't work and so on. So, but this is not the way of doing it. You should anticipate the disruptions. Maybe you may not be able to avoid them, but when they occur, you should be able to deal with them. And this should be a part of your design. So it's not as though the disruption strikes you at a later stage and you don't know how to do it. So, okay. So the global supply chain design consists of 2 steps according to us. And one step is this global supply chain formation. That is, you select all your players, all your supplier logistics providers in all countries with whom you want to deal, given your vertical, given the kind of products and services you are providing, who are all the people who are relevant to you. This is kind of social network that you prepare from all countries, from all over the globe. And also assess their performance, know about their countries, know about them, what are the risks, what are the innovations they are going to do, and what would be the performance and so on, how do you select them, and collect all this information. And building governance mechanisms or frameworks for partner selection, coordination and control. So, as we saw before, governance means partner selection, coordination and control. But in the design stage, you should build all the governance mechanisms or frameworks for doing it. When you are doing the governance, you just follow certain procedures. You run an optimization problem, given an order, you select the supplier, tell him what to do, and also execute this and control the entire thing. But you have to build all the mechanisms for doing that. So let us look at the first stage, which is global supply chain formation. The formation involves 5 steps. The first one is map the supply chain ecosystem for the industry vertical. We have done this before, so that's the map the supply chain ecosystem for the particular industry vertical, whether it is auto, whether it is telecom, whether it is logistics or whatever, and formulate the supply chain strategy. What is your strategy? Are you supplying the products? Are you supplying services? Are you going to outsource? What are the kinds of innovations you are going to look at? Are you getting into governments which are basically highly innovative into this? Are you getting into countries where they are modest and they may not be too much innovative and so on? And select possible locations for factories, distribution centers based on the investment climate. You look at the countries, where do you want to locate your DCs, distribution centers? You have to know the investment climate based on the ecosystem for that country and identify the supply chain risks. And once you have all this, you have a list of feasible supply chain configurations. In other words, for component 1, you have these suppliers in these countries, and these are the risk profiles. And these countries do these kind of innovations, and this is the transportation cost. So for each supplier, you have a database of what are the kinds of things that you use, and have a list of feasible configurations and so on. You are not doing anything except having a list of this, and maybe rank order the suppliers in terms of their cost, performance and all that. So that is the global supply chain formation. Let us look at each step. And the second one is governance second step is governance, which involves partner selection, coordination and control. In resilient supply chains, is a separate chain is formed for each order. The governance function includes partner selection from the group of pre-selected suppliers from step 1. and coordination, determining who does what, when, and communicating to everyone, and execution. So, this step involves building frameworks for partner selection, coordination, and control for the company or the vertical under consideration. For example, for partner selection, given an order, you want to select the partners for that particular order. So, which will minimize your cost, minimize your lead time, and so on. So, this usually comes into some kind of an optimization problem. And coordination determines who does what and so on. This is the typical supply chain planning problem. And execution is you have to build a tower or monitor the order status so that processes work as per plan and control exception events. So, building a control tower or designing a control tower which will monitor all the things that happen in the supply chain so that the execution is perfect. So, these are all the things that you need to do in the design stage. So, what is global supply chain formation? It's basically, this step is crucial. Now, when you are doing the supply chain formation, for example, you are dealing with apparels, toys, or auto and so on, you have to have domain knowledge of the vertical and the companies, their products, capabilities, reputation for quality delivery, and corporate and political connections, soft skills for negotiation of acquisition of assets, partner selection, risk assessment, and talent recruitment. I mean, this step is crucial for all this. And in emerging markets, dispute over asset acquisition can turn wicked, involving long drawn negotiations or abandoning the project. One has to be careful. This step people try to ignore. But in emerging markets, it can, when you are trying to, you think everything is going on, you plan, you go ahead, you order your machinery and so on. But the land and building are not ready and they enter into a dispute. So, then you get into problems of, negotiation and all that, and sometimes you win, sometimes you have to abandon the project, go elsewhere. So, one has to be extremely careful in this step. So, the 5 steps are: map the supply chain ecosystem for the industry vertical. For this one, these are the 5 steps that we have. And step 1, map the supply chain ecosystem for the industry vertical that we have. Here is of course the industry value chain, suppliers, manufacturing, distributors, and retailing. And you have the resources, which is infrastructure, foreign investors, and ports, airports, industry clusters, human, financial, natural resources. And also you have the institutions like the customs, export and other regulators, quality control, environmental, social, financial, and trade issues. And you have the delivery mechanisms like logistics, transport, and logistics parks, etc. So, basically you can, for your industry vertical, this is a generalized supply chain ecosystem, but for your industry vertical, for example, if it is auto, then you can map the auto one. And if it is, say, food, you can map the food one, and then these things, the regulations and the resources that are required and the delivery mechanisms, they particularly differ. If it is an electronic supply chain, you may want air delivery. This one, if it is books supply chain, then you may want home delivery, you want e-delivery, and so on. So, basically, these things depend on the vertical that you have. So, step 2 is formulate the supply chain strategy. So, let's look at what is the supply chain strategy here. So, decide on the product you are selling. In other words, are you selling the product in its form, or the knowledge of the ecosystem? In other words, in situation, if you are a trader, you don't sell any product, you are just orchestrating, and what you have is your knowledge and connections of the ecosystem with the government, with the other people, and so on. You can sell just the product. You can also sell the solutions like after sales, aircraft engines, for example, and Xerox. For example, aircraft engines are never sold. They basically are leased into the products, and these are called power by the hour. So, the aircraft engine manufacturers are paid for the hour the aircraft engine runs in the aircraft. If the aircraft is not flying, they are not paid. So if the engine is under repair, they are not paid. So it is up to the aircraft engine manufacturers to be on high alert and make its engines on operative each time, every minute. And similarly, Xerox sells not the printing machines, but they charge for page and so on. So there, Cemex and others, they sell value chains, deliver building materials to site rather than cement. So there are several innovations in terms of the business models that you have. So you should decide what you are selling, and depending on that, everything else depends. Innovations in products and processes and other ecosystem items to build the blockbuster industry subject to infrastructure constraints. So in other words, you should look at your ecosystem and what are the kinds of things, what the vertical under consideration, what are the innovations that are possible. Deregulation of the airlines or FedEx, courier services, Southwest, direct routes rather than hub and spoke, Tata Nano, which is this one, clusters, digital delivery, home delivery. That what is that? That are the innovations that are possible. These could be new to the market kind of innovations. They need not have to be new to the world kind of innovations. So in other words, these could be practiced in other countries by other companies. So, but you have to get them working for your vertical, for in your country, and identify the strategic areas for partnering or outsourcing in the value chain, including the risks of partnering. In other words, are you going to do everything yourself, or are you going to outsource some of this? So basically, make or buy decisions, local or low cost country outsourcing, foreign direct investment or outsourcing. In other words, if you are doing foreign direct investment, then you are going to have your own plants in the low cost countries, or you can outsource, you can have joint ventures, you can have several other things. So what is that you are going to do? This is a strategy that you need to follow this one. We are going from the start here. I mean, sometimes if your company is operating, you may want to start in the middle, but the point is, that is why we are calling it supply chain redesign. You have already a design, you have an already operations, you have a strategy, but by going through this kind of procedure, then you can see how you can improve yourself or change things so that you are more competitive. So there are product innovations. For example, in Hyundai, customized small Santro to suit Indian market. Nano is a fuel efficient 1 lakh car. When I said 1 lakh is the price of the car, so and that is the one. And Cummins produces diesel engines and power generators for small retailers, regional hospitals and farmers. So because there is the power shutdowns in India for long, so this is one that is power generators are very popular in both households as well as in business. And General Electric announced 2 revolutionary products, $1,000 handheld electrocardiogram and a portable 15,000 PC based ultrasound machines. So basically these are all used even now in this, originally developed for emerging markets, the ECG device for rural India and the ultrasound machine for rural China, but now is being sold in US, pioneering new uses of such machines. So once you have a machine, you could do something. So these are all product innovations. Although done for the emerging market, some of them, sometimes these can be transferred, these can be used even in developed markets. So there is what is called business model innovation. So business model innovation is reconfiguration of activities of the existing business model of a firm that is new to the product service market in which the firm competes. So the way you compete in the firm is different. One thing is to sell a product. That's one way of doing it. The second thing is, you can sell a service. In other words, in selling Xerox machines, you sell per page charges. So, for example, instead of selling servers and other equipment so on for storage, you can lease this space in the storage in cloud computing. So basically, there are several examples of these business model innovations. Southwest Airlines, for example, when it started, when the airlines were deregulated in the United States, Southwest Airlines borrowed a business model from interstate bus transportation and applied it to airline industry. Well, you can apply it here in India and so on. McDonald's brought traditional assembly line techniques into the fast food business. So basically, if you want to save costs and time and so on, then you have a menu driven service, and like it works like an assembly line. Xerox does not sell copying machines, but installs and maintains copying machines in offices and charges on per page basis. And powered by that, our aircraft engines are paid for the number of hours they are flying in a flying aircraft. So there are various kinds of business model innovations. You have to find out which one suits you best. And use innovations in regulations. The governments have deregulated the telecom industry and made many positive policies. Allowed private and foreign shops to this one, created special economic zones to attract equipment and other manufacturers, allowed foreign players to participate as manufacturing and service providers and so on. So companies should use these to advantage. I'm just giving you an example of the government may deregulate this one, but what happens is the companies should use these deregulation to their advantage. For example, if there is a FDI possible, then you should go to that country where telecom is deregulated, and you should use the special economic zones, and you should basically participate in manufacturing and service industries. So when you are selecting a supplier, or when you are selecting a country, a location, then it's important what are the possible innovations that you can use given the government regulations. And there are disruptions, and the cloud comes in a big way. The growth of cloud delivery models help to start up pay-per-use model rather than buying, installing and maintaining servers. The new cloud architecture can address the needs of orchestrators trying to manage loosely coupled networks. So one thing that happens is, if you don't want to manufacture anything, if you want to do your service only kind of thing, then it's possible you can use the cloud architecture as an orchestrator. And other industries such as healthcare, finance, logistics, education get disrupted by cloud. In healthcare, patient records can be accessed from the cloud. You know, the cloud is something which is being used, this one. For example, if you are an orchestrator, all your information can be in the cloud, and you can use, and all this big data that is collected by the cloud served in the servers of all the players, then you can use analytics to find to plan for your services. Cyber security, breach of search are big issues in cloud. That's an important thing, because this is a concentrated your database at one place. So your cyber security, in other words, if somebody hacks into your data, then you will have problems of this one. And also breach of trust. Your cloud operator has to be trustworthy, and you should not share your information with others, either by design or by mistake. So there are innovations in governance of this one. In other words, how do you want to govern this particular thing? So you want to do not own assets, orchestrate new mantra in business. And this is one way of doing it, but you may not be able to switch to this governance model right away unless you outsource a lot of it. If you are a manufacturer and your competencies are design, manufacturing and all that, you outsource to the suppliers, you outsource to the dealers and retailers and so on. You can also outsource all your manufacturing, you keep design and so on, and you just orchestrate. So that's the examples of Li and Feng, who does not own any factories but orchestrates a network of 15,000 suppliers, 29,000 employees in 40 countries, supplying goods to well-known consumer brands. And similarly, Boeing 77 jet assemblies is 3 million parts for more than 900 suppliers in 17 countries. Southwest, JetBlue, Ryanair retained only core branding and of the airline and put all other operations for bid. So they leased engines, aircraft and contracted out baggage handling and maintenance. So here what happens is, for example, the fourth party logistics providers, they basically own nothing, but they aggregate and provide transport, warehousing and distribution services to several customers by orchestrating the 3PLs. So the point here is that when you are studying during the supply chain formation stage, it is important you look at all the aspects of what are happening, what are the risks you are going to face from each of these suppliers and their ecosystem. What are the innovations in governance you can make, what are the innovations that you can make in products, processes and business models and so on. So that is step 2. And the step 3 is select possible locations for the factories. This is based on the investment climate. So in the first 2 steps, you have basically said in the first step 1, you have mapped the ecosystem. So ecosystem gives you an idea of the entire vertical or your own company, your resources that you are using, the garments you are in, and also the delivery mechanisms that you use. But then in the step 2, what is that you are doing? You are basically saying the supply chain strategy. What is supply chain strategy? Supply chain strategy involves what are the kinds of what are you selling? Are you selling the product, service or combination, whatever? And the second point there is what are the innovations that your vertical is doing and others. So what are the kinds of technology disruptions that are happening? And it can be through cloud, it can be through your product innovations. People are producing small cars, people are using mobile for their communications. People are using only ATMs, no bank branches. These are all the kinds of things that these are things happening. And look at your governance innovations. In other words, you may have a hierarchical structure today, or you may have some other structure, functional or product oriented structure. But then how can you improve your governance by basically using the new technologies? In other words, there are technologies, for example, the information technologies, there are sensor networks, there are other things which are coming, cloud and all that. Can you use them to advantage in terms of innovations? And what are the risks that you are going to face? Now, step 3 is select possible locations for factories. This is based on the investment climate. So, where are you going to locate your suppliers and so on? So, for the industry vertical, study the parameters that determine the investment climate of nations and regions and rank order the regions. Everything depends on your industry vertical. For example, if you are in oil or if you are in auto, then your investment climate is different. And basically, if you are in oil, you should be in oil rich, and there should be shipping infrastructure and other delivery mechanisms and so on. And you should be an expert in foreign exchange calculations and all that. But and also you should be prepared to a lot of oil trade happens overseas. So basically you should be more than just transporting the oil from one place to the other, or a logistics provider, or managing your inbound logistics. So identify the asset specific requirements from the suppliers. In other words, if you want to do you want some product which requires special machines, so they become asset specific. So every supplier may not have those kind of machines. So in which case you need to use the asset specific requirements specify those things. First, you should know the asset specific things we are going to mention in the next slide. That they could be site specific, they could be machine specific, and so on. So, and also what important are the clusters. Clusters are geographical concentrations of interconnected companies, specialized suppliers, service providers, and associated institutions present in a region. In other words, these will provide everything provided at one place. And the proximity of companies and institutions in one location fosters better coordination. So, it's important to see that there is better coordination and trust, lowering the transaction costs, minimizing the inventory, importing costs and delays, and so on. So, since everybody is close, then you can basically transfer small amounts. You need not have to keep inventory. You can follow just in time, and several other factors if you are in the same cluster. So, there is an advantage of being in a cluster. And what are the supplier asset specificities that are this one? You may require physical asset specificity, which refers to the mobile and physical features of assets such as specific dies, molds, and tooling for the manufacturing of a contracted project. So, in other words, you may require special tools, special machines, and so on for your this one. That is the physical. Their dedicated assets represent specificity represents discrete and or additional investment in generalized production capacity in the expectation of making significant sale of a product of a particular customer. Now, here supposing you are looking at green, making your products green. When you are making your products green, then if you were trying to think that because of the green is going to be the fashion of the day, then you are going to have significant product demand in near future, then you want to do an additional investment into the production capacity. Well, you may do it as the owner of a manufacturing, but you need to have the suppliers also do their capacity expansions. So, dedicated asset specificity, it represents the additional investment in production capacity with the expectation that you are going to make it big next day. Human asset specificity requires in a learning by doing fashion with long-standing customer-specific expectations. So, in other words, for example, all the software providers, these companies, both in India and abroad, they basically take graduates and then train them in all software languages as well as in programming and others. They have their own institutions where people are trained. So, in other words, this is a specific asset that you have to create, and it costs money, but you are doing skill-based training for this. So, this is the kind of training. Is your supplier going to do it? Well, he may do it, but he will charge you. So, but he may charge it, but you may impart all the specific skills that you have. And site specific specificity, site asset specificity refers to successive stages that are immobile and are located in close proximity to one another so as to economize on inventory or transportation. Now, supposing you have a port where you want to send all your goods. So, if you want to have a distribution center near the port, so that what you could do is to get a manufacturing site nearby, and from the get all your suppliers to have a supply hub near the manufacturing or near the DC, and transport via the port. So, to do all this, that means somebody here, your logistics provider, has to build a warehouse, or your suppliers need to have a supply hub near your manufacturing facility. So, these are all becomes site specific. What happens once you build and if the situation changes? Then these may not be useful. So, there is a risk associated with this, with all this. For example, if you build a warehouse and if the demand drops, the warehouse becomes empty. So if it is a specific temperature sensitive warehouse, then you have invested a lot in the air conditioning and other temperature sensitive things, and those things may go waste. So there are also what are called global competitiveness indicators, which require attention. These are basically to look at the country where you are in, and the competitiveness indicators are national policies for openness in trade and market. When you are looking at your supplier, you are looking at also his or her ecosystem. Now, one of the things of the ecosystem of the supplier is the governments. So, the national policies and openness of trade and the markets. You are interested, you want to get outsource something to them, but what are the national policies of the suppliers? So, best practices for international trade. So, in other words, do you have trade facilitation and others, or it takes 1 month or 2 months? Is it very expensive for transport and so on? And do you have legal and enforcement systems? In case of problems, do you have judiciary, effective judiciary? So that becomes an important thing. Infrastructure for a global economy. Do you have ports, airports? Do you have freight corridors and so on? Financial services for a cross-border commerce. Well, you have to deal with foreign exchange and transfers. So you should have financial services for cross borders, that is the banks on either side, which will deal with this one. But of course, you need human capital. So if you are looking at global competitiveness indicators like this, all these things become very important. So when you are selecting a supplier, or you are selecting a place for your DC, or you are supplying a place for something, then you should have a look at the country's global competitiveness indices, their judiciary, that's very important, and their best practices in international trade, because that affects your transportation costs and national openness and so on. Supposing they suddenly say they turn protectionist, then you would be in trouble. So it's very important that one should look at the national competitiveness. So if you look at the national competitiveness industries, so there are material available or information available on the global government policies, and their exemplars are 80%. Whereas if you look at top 5 exemplars are 70%, and OECD countries are 72%. But if you look at all the BRIC countries like China, India, Russia and Brazil, they are basically between 40 and 50. For example, India is 42%, and Russia is a little better, 45%, and Brazil is also 43%, and China is 50%. So I think you will find, in terms of the policies, these are exemplar countries. And these are all the BRIC countries where a lot of things are happening. You will find countries that have very good growth record like China, India, Vietnam, Laos, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh rank very low on these indices. And countries which rank very high, they don't attract much trade. So there is some kind of a dichotomy here. It's not necessary that you have a good ranking, that you should have very good growth. But what this diagram tells you is whether you can have this one, the people who are doing this trading here are facing risk, they are taking risk here. Whereas if you are in these countries, the risk will be less. So what probably is due with their low cost countries, their growth is high here, and if you are having good products, you should have short term investments into this. In other words, for a specific order, if you are doing the apparel order or if you are doing electronic orders, you should do very short to minimize your this one. In other words, you should finish your transactions within 6 weeks, so that before any changes happen. So these are about national policies that are important for this, and investment climate at various levels. You know, you look at the country that they are in, and what are the levels? Logistics and IT, regulations, resources and management. That is the country competitiveness index, which you can generate by looking at infrastructure, 3PL, software developers and software infrastructure. And you can look at the customs, trade, tax policies, industry, FDI, incentives, labor, unions, foreign exchange, legal enforcement and so on. You can look at the resources, human, financial, natural resources, mines, land, water and management skills. So these are all the ones that determine the country competitiveness. So you can have a scale, you can basically whatever is important to your vertical, you can scale them up and add them, so that you can get a score for a country, for a particular supplier in a particular vertical at that time. As you can understand that things can change. For example, the regulations can change. The resources can become expensive. So you should, once the resources become expensive, the logistics becomes expensive. So if you are looking at short term, then it's fine. But if you are doing a longer term, then these things could change very fast. And regions, you know, if you are looking not a country bigger, but regions, regional logistics and IT infrastructure, whatever is relevant. And government policies, in other words, their state government, center-state relations, tariffs, duties, sales taxes, and these are all the same as above. So if you take some states have more natural resources than the others. Some states have more agriculture than industry and so on. So basically you should look at for each state and then get what is called regional competitiveness index or state competitiveness index. Well, you can have vertical, this one, vertical specific logistics and IT infrastructure. As we said several times before, if your vertical is oil and gas, you need ports, you need several other things for oil. Whereas the regulations are very heavy in terms of oil, because you have to have a relationship with the countries who have oil, and then the oil prices change every day. The foreign exchange becomes an issue, and mining and other skilled resources are needed for the industry vertical, and clusters, R&D labs and so on. So the kind of resources that you need for at the vertical level is different. So you can have the vertical competitiveness index that for that. But of course, you can have at the company level, you look at the same things and have the firm competitiveness. So in other words, when it may look at you are doing too much of homework for this. It is important for this. This homework basically reveals under discussions or brainstorming, reveals what is good for you and what is bad for you. So the good for you, what are the innovations you can make, and the bad, and also it will tell you which one to avoid, which country should you avoid in what field. So it is very important that you make this kind of analysis on the investment climate before this. And what are these transaction costs? Transaction costs are the production quality and these are the costs that you have, and you have the delivery cost, shipping, inventory, asset specific, hard, soft infrastructure. Now, for example, in terms of delivery, sometimes it has to be asset specific. Supposing you are transferring big, huge equipment, power plant equipment like boilers and all that, they have to be specially dissected first, disassembled, and then reassembled at the place, and they have to be carefully loaded onto the truck, and from truck to the ship, and then from there. So you require asset specific inbound logistics for these kind of things. So you should be careful while you are doing the quote. And asset specific clusters, human financial power, and so on. So if you are in what, depending on the business, you should, if you have, say, in the auto business, then you have auto clusters. If you are in electronic, then you have electronic clusters. If you are in mobile business, you have such clusters. But these clusters may not be there in every country. So one has to look at the asset specific resources and so on. And of course, the institutions effect on social groups, the taxes, tariffs, and free trade agreements, and so on. And also you have coordination costs or broker fees that happens. So the search costs, all these things, there are a lot of search costs that are involved in the supply chain formation stage. But there are companies which basically have people in various countries collecting information on their vertical. Which are the companies, what are the trade policies, what are the government, this one, which state is better, where should I go, these kind of things. So that will gives you what is called the transaction cost. So if you look at the next step is identify all the supply chain ecosystem risks. What are the risks that the supply chain ecosystem faces? All possible social, political, environmental risks that may affect your ecosystem and the goods, information, and financial flows. Estimate the risk and identify what it takes for the resolution. This becomes very important, and you have to make a list of all the risks that can come from all the this one, not only your supply chain, from your resources, from the governments, from your delivery mechanisms, and so on. So outsourcing, for example, when you outsource, there is a loss of IP. When you outsource to somebody, you have to basically train them to use your software, or how to design your particular product, and so on. Quality issues, transport delays, foreign exchange fluctuations, energy costs escalation, loss of goods due to theft, piracy, and so on. So there, when you try to outsource and when you are doing something, either during the process of manufacturing or during the transport, there are several things that can happen. In case of mergers and acquisitions, all the risks associated with the supply chain ecosystem must be considered. Supposing when you are doing mergers acquisition with a particular company, you not only look at their financial and other this one, you should look at their suppliers, and so on. And there you should look at their government. You may buy a particular company, but or you may this one, the government may have some hidden clause somewhere which will not allow you to function independently. So one has to be careful in terms of mergers, acquisitions, and so on. Large scale and high degree concentration. For example, there are giant firms. Everybody thinks of big firms. There is this one like DHL, Flexatronics, etc. That they have big firms, but then what happens is when your firm, which is located in various countries, everything affects your company. So and also if you have clusters like low cost clusters in China, IT clusters in India, and these clusters become very highly vulnerable because they are all co-located, and anything that happens like natural disasters or any terrorist strikes, so basically they can get into problems. So it is large scale versus dispersed, this one. Of course, it's very important if you have clusters, if you have close by a concentration, then it's easy during normal times. But when disaster strikes, then you will have problems. So, the supply chain risks are political and societal risks, land acquisition or people displacement are involved, risks such as change in the government, state-center relations, corruption, social factors, these are also need to be assessed. So, basically you have these kind of risks everywhere. If resource incentive shortages such as infrastructure, oil, power, water, mining, etc. should be quantified, it becomes highly important that you do. So, then you have the cyber security, the biggest risk of connectivity. In other words, when you are connecting to the internet and you have a cluster which is or you have in a cloud platform which is operating all your, which is storing all your data and so on, then you have a biggest risk of connectivity. So, computer systems are subject to electronic attacks originating from sources that are usually unidentified. You don't know where, who is stealing your data and so on. The terrorist and counterfeit networks are also globally connected, and they follow the same HR process of recruitment, training people, and also systematic planning processes for implementing their objectives. So, one has to be extremely careful because your rivals are also as good as you or better sometimes, and they are doing in secrecy. While you plan everything and you plan the times and all that, they are doing everything in secret way. So, that's where the desire comes. So, I think in the next lecture I will talk about the feasible supply chain configuration for implementation.